from now on. So welcome to our career talk. And it's not just welcome from me, it's welcome from the new working group at EUNES. Jana, Dennis, and Mikael and I, we are both in the working group, and we are organizing most of the activities for this semester. And you can find, I have to make a little bit of advertisement for our activities, but you find information on our LinkedIn group and also on the EUPRERA website. But I will keep this short and I will immediately introduce Jim. So Jim Macnamara is our guest today and speaker. He's a distinguished professor in the School of Communication within the Faculty of Arts and Social Science at the University of Technology in Sydney. And I just talked with Jim a little bit, and I met him actually the first time in Oslo, but we didn't talk then in 2016, where he was presenting the AMEC framework, which he has been a part of developing. And he's also the author of 21 books. And actually, Jim, one of your books, Organizational Listening, I use in my teachings. So thank you for that. It was very useful. The webinar will be such that Jim will talk about his experiences based on his new book for more or less 35 minutes, and then we have time for questions and discussions. All right, Jim, go ahead.
So, thank you. So, hopefully my slides are all there. So, thank you very much, Esther, and hello all. Nice to meet you from multiple, looks like Europe and South Africa and UK, I think. I'll talk through some of the things, what possessed me to write a book called How to Be a Successful Academic Researcher. And I suppose by way of preamble, it came about because I've supervised PhDs and supervised early career researchers for almost 20 years. And I see the challenges constantly that they run into, some of the tensions between teaching load and research load, and often universities are not very good at passing on information and practical tips of how to be successful. And I started writing all this down and doing some workshops, and then someone one day said, "You should write it all up." And so the book sort of happened over about 5 years of joining up practical tips and case studies and so forth. There are 9 chapters in the book, and clearly tonight today I can't talk about all of them. These are the 9 chapters, sort of starting with very basic work of how to get into an academic research career, because not all academic jobs are research, and various chapters. I'm going to particularly dwell probably on the first part and talk a bit mostly about getting started and accelerating your career through, I call them 3 stages: the chrysalis, which is sort of the infant stage, riding on coattails, and then building contacts, and through to writing and publishing and disseminating your research for impact. Won't say a lot about getting into academic research because most of you are already into it, although getting into an academic job is not always getting into academic research. And it can be, I'm sure some of you would recognize that there's often a tension between the teaching workload and the research workload and the various administration and things we have to do. We all live in a changing higher education sector. I think that applies to Europe and most countries, the USA, Australia, and elsewhere. Specifically, many of us are seeing reduced government funding, so the days of lots of big research grants seem to have gone. In some countries where we rely on international students, governments are clamping down on visas. This has happened in Australia, where some universities have lost up to $100 million in revenue. So there's cutbacks and restrictions. Probably the big shifts that affect all of us, I think, though, and I'm sure you're aware of this, is academia has always been about writing and publishing and teaching, but there's a very big shift in many countries towards impact, not only doing academic research, but showing the impact of that research beyond the university and beyond scholarship, even into industry and society. And that sort of leads into an increasing demand on all of us to engage in industry engagement. And you'll hear the terms, I'm sure, research translation and knowledge exchange. And various governments around the world are pushing this. In some cases, it's really because they are neoliberal capitalist governments and they want academics to support business. But there's also a strong argument that as academics, we need to make sure that our work does flow on. In areas like the medical field, for example, there's long been an argument that researchers have to do the bed to bedside, as they call it, the bench to bedside, in that it's okay to do research in the research laboratory on the bench, but what's the use of that if it doesn't get to people's bedside and translate into practice? And so we need to be very, very mindful when we're doing academic research that it's not just a matter of doing the research and publishing in an academic journal. There's a lot of focus on industry engagement and research translation and knowledge exchange. Now, some people see that as an extra burden. I'm going to suggest to you that that's actually a great opportunity. Engaging with industry, engaging with governments, and I'll explain why. Of course, not all academic institutions are the same. We know that some of us go into research-focused institutions. There are also teaching-focused institutions, and it's very, very hard to build a research career if you're in a teaching-focused institution. So the ideal aim for anyone who's interested in research is to try to get a job in an institution that is at least focused on research as well as teaching. And of course, there's the high-level universities, the tier 1, 2, 3s in the US, the Ivy Leagues, the Oxford and Oxbridge and Russell Group in the UK, the Group of 8 in Australia, and so forth. And even within those, not all academic jobs are the same. And so even within a research-focused university, we can often find ourselves pushed towards a teaching-focused job or a research-focused job, which are often harder to get, or in most cases, I think many of us end up in an integrated job where we have to try and do both, and that requires balancing teaching versus research. And so that's one of the first things that I hope you'll identify with, is that I talk about these as our three masters, the trinity of academic work. And the two big ones, of course, are teaching and research. Research, we're looking for grants, we're looking for contract research, which I'm going to talk about a bit today. I say tonight because I'm in the Southern Hemisphere. Publishing, of course, but also research development, such as supervising PhDs. In teaching, we have our lectures and tutorials, but also curriculum development, writing new subjects. Many universities are moving into online courses as well. And so there's a lot of activity in teaching. The third area of academic work I want to spend a little bit of time on, because very often it's sort of seen as the poor relation of academic work, or it's taken up with mainly administration, and it's called service and engagement, or engagement. And effectively, this area is both internal and external engagement. Internally, we're asked to serve on various committees and serve in various roles like coordinators of various functions. Externally, engagement refers to engaging with professional bodies and engaging with industry, as well as universities and media and conferences and so forth. And what you'll find if you read my book, and what I talk a lot about and I'll discuss today, is that this area of service and engagement is not just a third area. It's actually a really, really important area of work, and it often gets sort of left to the bottom of the work plan. And I'll explain why the three areas are all important. So one of the first early chapters in the book talks about what I call chrysalis, coattails, and contacts. I'm sure you probably know from your science lessons at school that chrysalis is an insect pupa or papa, depending on how you pronounce it, that basic organism before it hatches to become a butterfly in the case of moths and butterflies. And so we start out as this sort of baby researcher. So what do we do at that chrysalis stage when we're doing our PhD or just finished our PhD in those very early years? It's very important to network. It's very important to volunteer. And it also is important to seek a good mentor. When I say network, I'm not talking about social networking, of course, and heading out. I'm talking about quite strategic networking, getting to know people who matter, people whose work you can learn from and emulate. A certain amount of volunteering. You do need to volunteer to work with other people, and certainly seeking a mentor is important. That flows into the what I call the coattails section and of your career, and that's where I'm talking about. To some extent, we've really got to try and ride on coattails. As a very early career researcher, it's very, very challenging to be able to try and land the big grants or land the big contracts. And so seeking out and establishing researchers in your field or your area of interest and trying to work with them. When I say volunteer, volunteer to be a number three or a four or a five on projects. I do make the qualification we need to avoid exploitation. As a young researcher or a mid-career researcher even, you don't want to be exploited by some lazy old professor who gets you to do all the work for them and then takes the glory. I'm not talking about that, but I'm talking about as a young researcher, if there is some senior people in your field that are doing big projects, they very often are looking for someone to work with them and help them. And jumping on and riding on coattails is that you can actually learn a lot in that process. So it's often very difficult to strike out on your own and lead your own projects in that early stage of your career. So I always find riding on coattails is good advice. But then, of course, as you start to develop your career, I've put the third C as contacts. Building contacts, and I've categorized them here as you want to build contacts with senior academics in your discipline because you learn from them and can work with them. You want to build contacts with senior academics in other institutions, locally and internationally. Again, you can learn from them, but also work with them potentially. But also here, I'm putting relevant professional associations and government and industry. And in the academic world, very often we become imprisoned in the academic cocoon and we spend our time with other academics. But particularly if we want to have impact, we want to gain extra sources of funding, and I'll explain some of those. I'm a very, very big fan of engaging with industry and government, and I'll give some examples of how that can be very, very important to your career. So getting out of the academic bubble and playing a broader role. In the book, I sort of have this very simple diagram of one of the diagrams that sort of talks about the sort of average or typical career path. And we do our PhD at the sort of entry level. And usually the first step for many researchers is an internal grant of some kind, a kind of seed funding grant. I'm not sure if all your universities do this, but most universities have some internal support, but that's actually quite limited. And sometimes it's even getting more limited. And so the next stage is to try and secure an external grant or a contract, and then working your way up to a medium size. And then finally, when you're going for large research grants, they are usually in collaboration with a number of researchers. And that, of course, those large research grants are the culmination of where we want to be. The thing I find in research careers, though, is many academics start out very successfully in the early stages. They do a great PhD, they get some early seed funding, they start to do great work, but there is a gap in the middle of the career. It's kind of a donut career, if you'd like, between that early stage and landing the big collaborative grants. And I sort of want to talk a bit about how you can bridge that mid-career gap, because many careers start off strong, lots of ambition, but there's a very hard road. And that's the period when you get caught up with heavy teaching loads and sometimes family responsibilities and all sorts of issues. And that can delay a career. So there's kind of that gap in the middle that I'm very interested in sort of helping people develop. So in the chapter on chrysalis, coattails, and contacts, one of the things, and I've already hinted at this, is one of the things I say very strongly, and there's a whole section called Engagement, the Key to Funding and Impact. And this is a little bit different to what some academic institutions will tell you, because it's very, very common for universities to prioritize teaching, and secondly, most universities, because they are prestigious, they want academics to go for those big research grants. And we're talking here about, we know there's different types of funding, and I know this varies between countries, but there's the internal university funding, not very much of it often. And then there's the grants by the academic grant institutions. So, there's the Horizon Europe, the European Research Council. In the UK, there's the UK Research Institute. Australia's got the Australian Research Council. Also, many government organizations like the European Commission also have a lot of funding type grants and even special grants in areas, in particular areas like Norway. There's also grants in specialized fields and industries. And so beyond the big generic granting bodies, there's also organizations like the National Institutes for Health, if you work in the health area, the National Science Foundation in the US, and there's literally hundreds of arts and cultural industries, aid organizations, agricultural research institutes, etc., that all provide research grants. The final area, though, that's often overlooked is there's also an area that are not grants. There's also an area that are contract research by government agencies and corporations and NGOs. And this is an area that universities, by and large, have not been all that good at tapping into. Universities have traditionally geared themselves up to be expert in writing those big grant applications for the academic grant bodies. But actually, there is millions and millions of euro and dollars and pounds, etc., out there in contract research. And I'm going to mention some examples of that. So when I say engagement, who am I talking about engaging with? I'm strongly recommending you engage with industry and professional associations, with government departments and agencies. And the photo on screen, you can see, if you might recognize, I know the UK participants will recognize 70 Whitehall as the Cabinet Office in London. I've done a lot of work with the UK government, and not grants, but particular contracts. NGOs, UN organizations like the World Health Organizations, OECD, almost all of these organizations also fund research and will fund research to academics. And of course, engaging with local community groups, engaging with industry conferences. We're all urged to present at academic conferences. And maybe I'm getting old and cynical, but to be honest, we're often singing to the choir when we're at academic conferences. They're great for networking. I love going to academic conferences to meet colleagues. But when we present research, we're presenting it to colleagues. We're singing to the choir. It's a very different thing. And Esther mentioned in the introduction that I do a lot of work with AMIC, the Association for Measurement and Evaluation of Communication, because I do research and evaluation. And I've gone to AMIC conferences for many, many years because that's where I'm talking to the industry, hundreds and hundreds of industry players, and translating our research into how it might change their practices. Publishing, of course, and I'll talk about publishing not only in academic but in professional journals. So just to contrast the two areas here, I've mentioned research grants, which of course are our bread and butter if we can get them, but I've mentioned research contracts. And I just want to explain a little bit about the difference between them, because universities, quite rightly, usually have research officers that are very expert in guiding us through applying for grants, because that's been their bread and butter for many years. Contracts come from often a commercial approach, and universities are often not very good at supporting commercial approaches. And I'll just explain the difference. So with a grant, of course, we're dealing with official research funding bodies. And with contracts, we're talking about government agencies, NGOs, and many corporations. Corporations can be problematic at times if they want research that is confidential or you can't publish, or sometimes corporations want research that proves what they already think. But many corporations are genuinely interested, and I'll give one or two examples. Now, the method of obtaining a grant or a contract is, as I'm sure you know, with grants, we have to sit and wait for a call for applications, and they come at certain times of the year. With contract research, organizations will issue an expression of interest or a request for quotation. Sometimes it's called an RFP, a request for proposal. In some cases, they do tenders where we have to compete, but very many contracts are issued by individual negotiations. And many of the research projects that I've worked on have been because I have contacts where they've actually then had a series of meetings and then invited me or a team of researchers to take on a project. I've put an asterisk there to point out also that many organizations, you'll discover if you don't already know, have thresholds under which competitive quotes or tendering are not required. So if you were going for a very large contract, very often there's a tendering process. But many organisations, if it's below a certain level, and for example, with the New South Wales government in Sydney where I work, the $50,000 is the threshold that an individual department head can approve research. Above that, it has to go through procurement. So guess what? I happen to have research projects that come in at $48,000 or $49,000 because they are direct appointment. I don't need to go through. So knowing these kind of rules, etc. So understanding EOIs and RFQs and RFPs are very, very important. The approach to grants, of course, is it is very important to work through the University Research Office because granting bodies have complex rules and regulations and processes that we have to follow, and our universities can guide us. The approach with contracts is universities really don't have a lot of support, I find, in the commercial area. And in fact, in many university research offices, they don't actually even understand the commercial world. And so it's individual networking is what can tap you into this funding. The application process for a grant, of course, is a formal application. It's usually a long proposal. I don't know about you, but some of the funding bodies that I've worked with have proposals that take up to 6 months to prepare. They are 30 to even hundreds of pages long. They're and your chances of getting them are 5 to 10%. Contract research, typical approach is you have a meeting, you have a discussion. If they like you, they ask you to write a short proposal, and they can make the appointment. And it tends to happen very, very quickly. And it's very, very different. I've landed research projects under contracts with a proposal of 2 to 3 pages. And the reason for that is I've already had several meetings, gone and had discussions. We've talked about what's required, and we've already reached a verbal agreement. And they decide they do want you to do the research. So they really don't want a long proposal. They just want a short proposal with a budget, and off you go. The assessment process in a grant, of course, it's academic merit and the social value of the project. It's done by independent authorities. In the case of contracts, it is about meeting the funder's needs. And of course, that's an important consideration that we don't want to do research that meets a funder's needs that may not be of publishable or not be of any other benefit. So what we look for in contract research is where we have to meet the funder's needs, but are there broader societal benefits as well and publishing opportunities? And many, many organizations, particularly government agencies and NGOs, are very, very interested in research that also can be published and contribute to knowledge generally. The key criteria with a grant, of course, is it's completely anonymous. It's independent peer review. We don't even know who's reviewing it. They don't know who we are. In the case of contracts, it's completely different. It's all about the relationship, building those contacts, having a relationship, and the organization actually wants you to do the research, and then they often will find the way to make that happen. So they're two very different worlds, the grant world and the contract world. We can't ignore the grant world. We want to be in that, but grants take a lot of work, and particularly in our early career stages, it can be quite challenging to get grants and very, very difficult to get large grants. And what we can do in that mid period of our career is keep our mind open to contract research projects that can be smaller, but also many of them are short term. And I've used a table in the book, for example, that talks about what if you land a multi-million-dollar grant over 3 or 4 years, but typically there are 5 or 6 or 7 or 8 researchers on the project. And when you boil it down to how much money per month that's generating, a contract of $50,000 for 1 or 2 researchers over 3 months actually ends up being more revenue per month. And you can do 2 or 3 projects in 1 year. So I'll talk more about building those contracts, but I just wanted to really emphasize the two worlds of funding, the grant world and the contract research world. With writing and publishing, which is a whole chapter in the book, and of course it's absolutely essential, the old adage, publish or perish, is still a mantra in the academic world. We are urged to write in the quality journals, the high impact journals, research monographs, and conference papers, depending on your discipline. And I just urge you to think about conference papers. Many academics overdo conference papers. They spend a lot of time writing them. And, I'm an old cynical professor. I've been to ICA and many, many conferences, and you present a conference paper in a track session where there are 5 people at 8 a.m. on Sunday morning. How much is that really worth? I think it's very worthwhile going to those conferences for networking, but many conference papers take a lot of work, and you have to question the actual benefit of it. So focus on quality journals. Think about conferences cautiously. Now, the challenge we have, of course, is to publish. It depends on having a completed research project, and having a completed research project depends on getting the funding, whether it's grants or contract research. So I just want to return to my point about engagement and talk about what I call the virtuous circle of academic research. Now, don't be intimidated or frightened or shocked. But as Esther said, these are the books I've written. I've written 21 books in my career. 9 of those were professional books. So I didn't come into academia until I already had a 20-year career, including 11 years running a commercial research company. But in my field, I wrote a number of practical handbooks on communication and marketing. But I've also written 12 academic books. 9 of them are research monographs. I wrote 1 textbook, 1 handbook, which is the one I'm talking about tonight, How to Be a Successful Academic Researcher, and 1 actually book of creative works. The other thing I write, though, beyond books, I want to come back to this idea of building your contacts and building your engagement. The other thing I strongly recommend is writing research reports. And these are reports that, in the case of one of my major research projects, has been about organizational listening. And I've now been working in that area for more than 10 years. And it started in 2013-14. And the first stage of the research, I published journal articles, first priority, but I also published a research report. And the research report was not for academics. It was produced as a PDF, distributed online, and had more than 3,000 downloads. And so making that, and of course it was written in a slightly simpler language. I went to endnoting rather than in-text references, so it was more readable for non-academics. But that research was published in a research report, so it becomes accessible to government agencies and companies and other organizations. And then in 2016, I worked in the UK in the famous year of Brexit, and I was doing research there into organizational listening, or organizational non-listening, as it mostly was at the time. And I published a research report jointly with my university and London School of Economics. And as I said, these are not expensive to produce. I produced them as PDFs. They were never printed. They were distributed online. So they're basically quite low cost to do. In fact, the first one, you didn't even typeset it. I used a word processor, and I just paid a graphic designer to do a cover. The second one, I managed to afford to be able to pay a designer to lay out the interior. But again, they were produced as PDFs. But producing research reports that reports your research, but still with academic references, perhaps as endnotes, but presents it in a way that government and industry bodies relevant in that field can digest. And these research reports, to me, generated literally dozens and dozens of inquiries from organizations who said, we would like to have some research, something like that, or could that apply to our organization? So it generates invitations to speak at conferences, both industry and professional as well as academic. It generates inquiries to do more research. I also write for professional journals. as well. So when I finish a research project, whether it's the conversation, I think the story in the middle is written for communication director in Europe. And on the right-hand side, you'll see an OECD report on public communication. This came out just, I think it was in early 2023. And this is an OECD report, but I contributed a significant amount of research to that report. And I think my research is cited 23 times in that report. Now, that report goes literally to governments all over the world. And so these are ways that you can look beyond the traditional academic journal article to really get your research out there. And by getting it out there, it does generate inquiries. Speaking at conferences, I do a lot of it. And of course, once you do research, and particularly if you publish, if you just leave it in journals, nobody sees it other than academics. Of all those conferences I just put on screen, only one of them is an academic conference, but they are major, major conferences. The Prague Media Forum in 2022, there were 650 media professionals in attendance. One of them down the bottom is presenting in the Cabinet Office in Whitehall, talking to senior government communicators and policymakers. And so these are all ways that spread the word that can generate leads and inquiries. And of course, yes, as you get into big ones, it's the famous Berlaymont building in Brussels for the EC, and that's little me way over the other side presenting a research report relevant to European communication, communicators and policymakers. So to try and make sense of that, I thought I'd just bring that together into a case study. I've talked a lot about principles of not only publishing academically, but engaging and building contacts. Let me just give you a very quick case study. And so this is the World Health Organization. In 2006, actually, I joined the International Association for Measurement and Evaluation of Communication, AMIC. So I've done a lot of work in evaluation. I actually started my evaluation research in a commercial research firm as a practitioner. I've specialized in it in academic work. So I joined the industry body, which a lot of academics don't do, but I strongly recommend. In 2015, I became chair of the academic advisory group because I felt that the industry body was not actually looking at academic research sufficiently. This often happens. So rather than just simply sit back in my ivory tower, I said, okay, why don't we have an academic advisory group? I still chair this group. I pulled together, I think it's now 8 senior academics in different countries, and we have an advisory group to AMIC. And this is all free time. We volunteer this time. In 2016, I was the winner of 2 gold awards and the Platinum Grand Prix Award for evaluation at AMIC and presented in the summit at their summit in London. Why did I do that? There's a funny story to it because it was actually close to where some of you are. It was in Sweden at a AMEC summit a year before that someone said to me, oh, you're an academic, but you don't actually do evaluation in practice that has to work. And so the following year, because I do evaluation projects as contract research, I entered 2 of my projects in the AMEC Awards and managed to carry out gold for both of them and the overall platinum award. So I was making a point that academic research is relevant to industry. So why does all that matter? In 2018, I attended the AMEC Global Summit, which was in Barcelona. I was a keynote speaker presenting previous evaluation research, but also there I met and talked with 2 representatives from the World Health Organization from Geneva, and they were very interested in evaluation. They wanted advice and help, and I was very happy to provide free advice and comments and suggestions to them. In 2019, in November 2019, the WHO's Western Pacific office contacted the WHO headquarters in Geneva and asked for someone to help them on evaluation. And the reason was it was November that there were already rumors coming out of China about a very dangerous virus and the importance of health communication to be effective. That resulted in early 2020, in March 2020, I was appointed to lead global evaluation research for the World Health Organization, and I led that project through 4 years. and I won't disclose the amount of money, but I led a research team of 6 researchers, and we evaluated all of WHO's COVID and World Health Day communication over 4 years. So you can imagine that was a fairly substantial research project. In fact, it was a 24 hours a day project in many cases. And so to me, I just wanted to make that example of and people still say to me, how on earth does an Australian down in Sydney win 4 years of research to lead research for the World Health Organization? But hopefully you can see a pattern there of engaging with industry, contributing back to industry, working with industry, attending their events, networking, building contacts, building a reputation that ultimately leads to that. Just another very quick example. As you know, I also do organizational listening research. When I was living in London in 2016, I published the first organizational book on organizational listening. And that immediately brought an invitation in 2017 from a company, in this case, a European, very interesting, a non-profit corporation based in the Netherlands, Achmea International. And they invited me to address the CEO's summit that was in Istanbul that year to talk about how the organization might benefit from better listening, particularly to customers and staff, employees, and business partners. And it was a formal invitation that resulted in a 2-year research project working with Achmea headquarters in the Netherlands and with several of their subsidiaries, Inter-American in Greece, Union Postovna in Bratislava, in Slovakia, and some work in Australia. And that was a 2-year research project, also became a quite major research project. And I barely got back to Australia in the middle of that, and a New South Wales government agency asked me, could I evaluate a major campaign that was running to build a 2040 to 50 plan for developing Sydney. And they were doing public consultation and they wanted to have an evaluation. And I went on to do that project, and so on it goes. And so I was just trying to show how these things leapfrog one to the other. These are just some of the research projects that I've done over recent years. So the World Health Organization sits near the top of the list, along with the Achmea work. But I've recently done work for the NATO Public Diplomacy Division in Brussels, the UK Cabinet Office I've mentioned. And in my home country, I've worked, I think, with 9 projects with the New South Wales government, and so on, and many others. So I really will sort of draw that to a close and maybe a summary, coming back to this idea of the virtuous circle of academic work, and how have I managed to get a lot of research and a lot of publications. And sort of starting at the top left, I talk about joining industry and professional organizations. Not many, you can't waste your time, but strategically choosing 1 or 2 that are very relevant to your interests. Serving on committees, like I volunteered to work on the AMIC advisory group. Offer to give speeches, conduct workshops and seminars. I think before I did the paid work for WHO, I did a free online workshop for them. So offering to do that, because that showcases your expertise. Write articles for professional journals, provide advice, write proposals, all of those things. And then, of course, that engagement leads into research, where you do research design, the field work, the data analysis, you write and produce the outputs. But as I've said, academic journal articles, maybe book chapters, maybe research monographs, conference papers, creative works potentially if you're in that field. And then the dissemination, the translation, the transfer, the exchange area. I do press releases on my research reports. I do academic conference presentations, but I also speak at industry, professional and government conferences, media interviews, write short articles for professional journals, social media posts. And that then leads on to impact, where you can, in some cases, contribute policy recommendations in your research reports, publicly release policy papers, do training for professional industry bodies, more media interviews, keynote speeches at industry, consulting through to an expert advisor. And then you go on to back to engagement to continue doing that kind of engagement. So I see that as the virtuous circle, where we often flick over engagement or service and engagement is taken up with internal service and engagement. So I guess one of the secrets to me is carving out time to be able to do external engagement strategically and carefully that builds your research career. And then during your research career, you're going back into industry and translating it with government and professional bodies and so forth. The criteria, of course, for seeking external partners, always academic opportunities and publishing are highlighted. But of course, the additional thing with contract research is we've got to meet the partner's needs. And I put a third element that ideally, always we want to choose projects that meet our passions and our interests. But if you can combine those three things, you can do very well. So a few final tips. We can have some questions, hopefully. We've got to decide in our career whether it's teaching, research, or integrated, and whether we want to lean one way or the other. These are very practical tips, and my book is not an official guide. There are things in it that my university perhaps wishes I didn't say, but if you want to do research, you have to fight to protect your research time. Anyone find that challenge? Teaching programs can be insatiable. The university will invent new courses. They'll want to update courses. They'll take you through accreditations. They're always inventing a new T&L committee, etc. Also, universities will create mountains of admin. We love bureaucracy and administration in universities, so be cautious about committees, etc. So it's that protecting our research time and carving it out. The honest truth, though, is you probably also need to work much more than the 35-hour week that university HR departments tell us we work. Every successful academic researcher I know works far, far more than that. So don't believe the university's HR spin. Engage in your industry, your profession, and the related fields. Getting out of the ivory tower. I find it's good for your personal career, but it also meets the requirements of the academics of today and the future. And that is that we need to be engaged. We need to not only produce scholarly work, we need to have impact. We need to translate it into practice, into policy, and we need to engage in knowledge exchange. All your career, write. I began my career in journalism. So I started, and I asked my journalism teacher many decades ago, how do you become a good writer? And he just said, write, and write. Just keep writing and you'll eventually get good. And join up your work in the virtuous circle. Think of that virtuous circle. And that it does require us to try and balance our teaching workloads. But don't overlook engagement, and don't let engagement suck you into just being internal engagement. Being very, very engaged externally. I hope my case studies will show you that it can be very, very beneficial to your career. So I hope there's a few gems and ideas in there. I hope it makes sense. And I think the best way, Esther, is to throw it open to questions.
Oops. Absolutely. Thank you very much, Jim, for this very hands-on and interesting presentation. So,
Raised hand.
Renee, you raised your hand. I just want to say you can do it live or in the chat, whatever you want. So, Renee?
Wonderful presentation. Thanks, Jim. And it was just so to the point in the sense of us trying to balance between being an academic and a researcher and an industry person. I know that in Australia there's a big drive, or there's not really a either or. It's you have to be involved in industry because you are supposed, as an educator, to do both. But the big, and I fully support everything that you said, because that has been my experience as well. And by the way, by being more invisible to the industry, we as academics, as your point, your case study, need to build that bridge between academia and industry, not just for ourselves, but also for our students. Because, you know, if there's one saying that I have an absolute pet hate for, is that when students reach the industry, that they have now entered the real world, because as if our universities are not real worlds. So, but it's our own mistakes as well, because we live in a make-believe world that all the models work out fine, and we don't test it. The question that I have for you is, how can we work on, and probably through EUPRERA and Global Alliance and those platforms, work on a really strategic effort to network various academics and educators throughout the world to benefit each other for research contracts, because at this stage, as you rightfully said, it is the contacts that I have that has enabled me to do various types of international research. But I'm looking for something that we can drive as a group of academics and educators and researchers that can benefit both the industry and our own small context where we operate in. So that's really what I'm looking for, something tangible there.
Yeah, I think there's no one answer to that. I think there's, and I'm not suggesting it's easy, but a couple of things that can be done. I mean, at the very beginning, I mentioned writing on coattails. So senior academics, senior professors, and not all, some are very bound in the industry, but in the academic world. But some academics, senior academics, have contacts. Someone like me, I'm getting in the latter stages of my career. I'm very happy to hand over contacts and introduce other researchers. And I'm getting tired. I want someone else to help me do the work. So riding on coattails is an important thing, where don't be exploited, but if you can work with other senior researchers. As groups, I mean, I mentioned the AMIC example with the Academic Advisory Board. It was my observation as an academic, and the observation of many others like Ansgar Zerfas in Germany and others, Anne Gregory in the UK, that AMIC was not using academic research. Some of its early work was pretty basic. So rather than sit around and complain, we went to AMIC and said, you really need to work with academics. What can we do? And we said, what about an academic advisory board? We can't overrule your board, but we can be an advisory group. And so we formed the advisory group, I don't know, 2015 or something. Not perfect, but we do have an input to the AMIC framework and the things that they develop. You'll see a lot of my material on the AMIC site. In fact, last year we launched an AMIC scholarship for academics. So I was always concerned that there were no academics presenting at the AMIC summit, except me usually. So we launched a scholarship thing, and AMIC puts up $5,000 for that scholarship for an academics to submit papers, and the best one is a keynote in the main hall. So we can do things. The other thing that I've been involved with in my university is forming formal partnerships with organizations. So I've recently led a MOU with OECD, and this is a pretty exciting one. It's the OECD Open Government Unit, because I work a lot with policy, Open Government, Civic Space and Public Communication Unit in the Public Governance Directorate in Paris. But my university now has a formal MOU where we contribute to research reports. We work on the public communication network. So that's an MOU relationship, and now other academics can join into that relationship. In Australia, we've got an MOU with the Australian Museum, and that's partly arts and history, but actually it's got a huge scientific component and a major research focus. And so now I think there's about 20 academics working with the Australian. In fact, we've even made joint appointments where we have 50-50 appointments working with the museum and my university. So there's many things. But I think as a young researcher, you start out by riding on the coattails, working with colleagues, and joining. And often you've got to join at a low level. When I first joined some organizations, I was just a member, and then you volunteer to serve on a committee, and then you do something, and you work your way up. And you can't do it on too many because our time is precious, but choosing one or two organizations and making a contribution, and that can lead to really good contacts. And I'd like to say that in groups like AMIC. I've got friends all over the world that we work really closely with. And, places, I could tell you another story. I mean, I was recently doing research with the NATO Public Diplomacy Division in Brussels, you know, particularly under pressure with the Ukraine conflict, and the military saying, what's the use of public diplomacy? What's the value of it? And I got a phone call. And why did I get a phone call and asked to go to Brussels? And it was through John Burke at AMIC. And I can't even do research in Europe because you have to be in a European country to work with NATO. But they said, okay, Jim's working with AMIC and AMIC's in the UK. So and just networks of contacts. And so we did a joint project with AMIC and my university working with NATO in Brussels.
Thank you.
Sorry, that's a long answer. Sorry. Jana, I think, had her hand up. I saw a hand up before. Is it Jana?
Yes, so thank you for your insight. The talk was really inspiring and motivating. I really liked it. So regarding the associations, I'm quite interested in how to find the way to the kind of right association, because you are talking about AMEC, and I'm thinking of like there's so many associations. So do you have any tips where like to go to, or how to decide to go to which association and engage there?
Yeah, good question. I'm a real believer that, and I put on that one of those last slides, my 3 circles about the funders' needs, the university, the academic requirements, and your passions. And I really believe in everything you do to sustain a career, bearing in mind, I'm being very frank and saying, if you really want a good career, you're going to work long hours at times. I do a lot of travel. I sometimes travel 24-hour flights 6 and 7 times a year. If you want to sustain that, you have to be passionate about it. So think about what you really love. What is it you want to do in the world? And then look around you to say what industry. They could be arts institutions, they could be cultural institutions, they could be business. But what is your area? So I do think it starts in your heart. What is it you are passionate about? Because the passion is what will sustain you through the tough times. I'm not pretending academic research career is easy, because we're always going to be under pressure to teach. That's a worldwide issue. Because that's the cash cow of universities. That's where most of their income. The fact is, we must be recognizing that most universities lose money on research. Research costs money. Even when they get a grant, they still spend far more than what the grant is, because many grants don't cover salaries. So research is an investment by universities. All their money comes from teaching. And so we're always going to be under that pressure. So we're going to work hard, we're going to work long hours. But yeah, I think to answer your question, it's, to me, I was a practitioner for many years, and I started to question way back in the 1990s. I worked for Microsoft in marketing, and they kept asking me, how do we know? What's the value of this? How do we know it's working? And I couldn't answer the question. I didn't know how to measure it. So I went and did a master's by research and then a PhD to find out how could I measure it. So I did it in practice, realized I love doing that, and thought that's an area I want to go into. And then organizational listening fell out of that, because I found out that evaluation is just about listening. You've got to go and listen to the audience to find out what they are receiving, what they're thinking. And so that's been my passion all of my life. So if you can think about what it is that drives you, then look for the organizations that are credible organizations you can identify with in that sphere.
Thanks a lot.
Yeah, I see Renee has mentioned the Global Alliance. Global Alliance is an interesting body because it is a bit of a mixture of practitioners and academics, which can be good. So if you can find crossover organizations, that's useful. And of course, I'm a member of the ICA, the International Communication Association. It's a really important body. I love going to their conferences. I go to their conferences to learn. I love learning still. I go there to learn and to meet other academics. I don't really care. In fact, the last 2, I didn't even bother submitting a paper. What's the point of presenting to 15 people at 7 o'clock in the morning or something? But the networking is valuable. And I'd rather do a keynote to an industry conference of 600 people.
I also had the question, Jim. I think it was very interesting to hear about academic research and contract research. And I was wondering, because my first 20 years of my career was in advertising as a consultant, and then I started my academic career and now a PhD. But then how would you balance the when you do contract research that it's still academically and you don't, I don't want to call it consultancy trap, but I think you understand what I mean. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, it's a very, very good question because sometimes organizations will actually come to you to say they need advice. They actually want consulting. But as an academic, what I say to them is any consulting I give you is research findings. It's evidence-based. And
Mm.
so you can very easily turn a consulting project into a research project because we don't just give opinion as academics, which often does happen in the industry. You know, someone gets 20 years experience and then they give people their opinion
Yeah.
based on their experience. We don't do that. And so I never accept a contract project that does not involve research, even though ultimately it might be providing advice. So recently in Australia, it's probably an Australian example, but the Reserve Bank of Australia is under enormous pressure because interest rates are high and they're under huge pressure to lower interest rates. But they have very good economic reasons for trying to address inflation. And so they contacted me to say, you know, we need advice. How do we communicate to the public why we need to keep interest rates where they are? My advice to them was, you need to do some research and to find out, you know, what people think and why do people think what they're thinking. What do people know about inflation? How do they interpret it? Then you will gain your answers from the research. And they went, oh, okay. So they commissioned a piece of research. The answers to their questions came out of the research. But yes, I don't do straight out consulting. Also with contracts, I only do contracts if there is publishing rights. I want to be able to publish. So many organizations will want to do research but hide the results. That's not the kind of contract research. But you know, when you work for government agencies, many, like during COVID, I worked with the New South Wales government and they wanted to evaluate their COVID campaigns. They were very happy to share the findings with all other government agencies. And same with WHO. WHO encourages publication of research. Um, but there's a few cases where organizations don't want to publish. So if they don't want to publish or they want to skew the results, you know, to please their bosses, that's not the kind of contract research. So you selectively do it. But yeah, it's interesting how almost any advice or consulting, as academics, we take an evidence-based approach, which means my advice will be based on doing the research first, and then I will draw conclusions and findings from the research as evidence-based recommendations.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you. That was useful input. Anybody else who has some questions? Because we are a little bit over time now. So
It's 9 o'clock at night for me.
yeah. Not something from Chris, not surprising. Thank you, Chris. Yes. Because yeah.
No, just reading Chris's comment. Yeah, it's a good one.
Yes. All right, everybody. First of all, Jim, thank you so much for this very relevant and useful webinar. I thought it was a good start for us for the new year, and it was practical and hands-on. So I recommend everybody to buy your book and read it. I ordered mine. It hasn't arrived yet, so I'm looking forward to
There's a paperback coming, so there's an ebook. The typical publishers, another tip for academics is, you know, when you publish, always insist on a contract with paperbacks, because if they do a hard copy, it sells for hundreds of euro or dollars, very expensive. And the publishers do that to recoup money by selling to libraries. You want to be able to get a paperback or an ebook and it becomes affordable for students and others. So I'm told from Edward Elgar that the ebook's available now and the paperback is coming.
Yeah, perfect. And if anybody else has more questions, I guess they can reach out to you directly.
Sure.
Okay, good. Have a nice day, everybody, and see you next time.
Best wishes in your careers.
Thank you.
Thank you.